Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, breaking down the game we love each and every day. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe. If you have yet to become a believer, have not locked into the voice of college football, please check out the videos. We believe we will get you sold very soon. All right. We love to analyze the game. Rank, rate, analyze across the board. We do it in the offseason with the conferences. We rank the conferences based on the results on the field from the previous season and rate the Power 5 1 through 5. We're halfway through 2019, and we're going to do it this season involving the two conferences that I believe have a claim or a debate as to number one. There is a clear distinction for me as to best conference in college football. It's the same conference that I believe to be the best conference before they ever stepped on the field in 2019, and I believe the results have proven that out to date. I am matching up here the SEC and the Big Ten. They are the two best conferences in college football. Ironically, but also not so ironically because it's certainly connected, they are the two power brokers in college football. They put the most rear ends in the seats, the most eyeballs in front of the TV screens. They make the most money, and they produce the best product on the field. The Big 12, I believe you've got a slim argument this year. ACC fans, Pac-12 fans, put it away for this year. Maybe you can give it a shot next year. And for the ACC, of course, you've got Clemson. You've got Clemson to carry you possibly again in the college football playoff. But from top to bottom, and certainly the top tier teams that will compete for postseason play and for top 25 status, the SEC and the Big Ten are the best. Based on this season's results, the Big Ten is 31-8 against non-conference competition, 5-4 in Power 5 play, and 0-1, only one top 25 game played by the Big Ten. Now, you could argue that Iowa knocked Iowa State with that game. They knocked them out of the top 25 by beating Iowa State because the Cyclones were in the top 25. But to date, the only top 25 team that the Big Ten has played is Arizona State, and Michigan State lost at home to the Sun Devils 10-7. The SEC is 31-11 with three more losses against its out-of-conference competition. They are 6-6 against the Power 5 as opposed to the Big Ten's 5-4, and the SEC is 3-1, not 0-1, 3-1 against the current top 25. You know that I don't put a whole lot of stock in the AP and the Coaches Poll Top 25, but it is a barometer. Certainly those are the best teams in the country generally. I don't think there's any question about that. It's not like the AP poll has some team ranked at number 8 that should be 50th. So it is valid to some extent. The SEC is 3-1 against the top 25. That would be an Auburn win against Oregon. That would be LSU against Texas as well. I believe that's Georgia against Notre Dame. So 3 substantial quality wins for the SEC right there. Okay, what we are doing now is we are going to take the 14 teams in the Big Ten. We are ranking them 1 through 14. These are my personal power rankings and seedings. This is not based on the current results or the current standings. Now, during the offseason, I take my opinion out of it, and I just see the conferences based on where the standings place them. I just rank them strictly on the standings, but we've only played half a season. The standings aren't completely valid right now because obviously some teams have front-loaded schedules, other teams have back-loaded schedules. So the standings aren't complete, of course, and they're not even valid at this point to a certain extent. So I'm going to rank the teams in the SEC and the Big Ten, and then I'm going to match them off in a mythical 10-game series because people ask me all the time, if Ohio State played Georgia, who'd win the game? If Clemson played Oklahoma, who'd win the game? My answer typically is either one of them could win the game. We're not talking about Alabama playing Illinois. We're not talking about Clemson playing Kansas. We're talking about high-powered teams, and then as we go down the list, we're talking about marginal teams, and then we're talking about very bad teams. Either team could win one game. So what I typically like to do is think, okay, if they play 10 times, because I can give that a better barometer and a more accurate barometer of the quality of the teams. This is not scientific at all. This is just my judgment based on the 2019 version of the teams in the SEC against the teams in the Big Ten. For a little recent historical perspective, I went back to 2010. I looked at all the games between the SEC and the Big Ten. They have played 48 times, which is not nearly enough. We're looking at 10 football seasons, and the Big Ten and the SEC have only played 48 times, and almost all of them, I would say 80% of those games, have been in postseason play. So they rarely schedule games against each other. Just imagine Alabama traveling to the Shoe to take on Ohio State, or Penn State going to Athens, and you could just fill in the matchups. Michigan and LSU have never played. That's a travesty. Michigan and LSU have never played. All right. My rankings in the Big Ten go like this. And again, out of those 48, guess. I'll give you 2 more seconds to guess who has won how many games between the SEC and the Big Ten since 2010. The tally to date since 2010, SEC 29, Big Ten 19. Okay. My rankings of the Big Ten teams go like this. So Ohio State's the best team in the Big Ten. Wisconsin's number 2, Penn State 3, Michigan 4, Iowa 5, Minnesota 6, Michigan State 7, Nebraska's number 8. I've got Purdue at 9, Indiana 10, Northwestern 11 right now, Illinois 12, Maryland 13, and Rutgers certainly an easy last worst, number 14 in the Big Ten. I have ranked the SEC as follows based on the performance to date. LSU at number 1, Alabama 2, Georgia 3. I've got the Florida Gators at 4, Auburn at 5. At number 6, Missouri, South Carolina at 7. Texas A&M next, Ole Miss, Kentucky, Tennessee at 11, Mississippi State 12, Arkansas at 13, and Vandy at 14. All right. And I would love to go through the 48 games, but some of those stand out. Of course, Ohio State beat Alabama in the national semifinal in 2014 at the Sugar Bowl, and Ohio State also lost a Gator Bowl to Florida, and they beat Arkansas in the Sugar Bowl in 2010. So the Buckeyes are 2-1, and taking on an LSU team that is 2-1 against the Big Ten, having lost to Wisconsin a year after they beat Wisconsin in one of those marquee opening game neutral site matchups. And then Iowa also lost to LSU, so the Tigers beat the Hawkeyes in a bowl game in 2013. So Ohio State and LSU, I was inclined to say the 10-game series would finish at 5-5. Then I thought, is that a cop-out? Well, not necessarily if I think that's the way it would finish out. But I thought a little bit more, and I am grinding out an Ohio State 6-4 win over LSU in a 10-game series. Next up, we've got Wisconsin taking on Alabama. The two teams met in 2015. Bama won that game 38-17. Wisconsin, since 2010, is 2-3 against the SEC, having lost bowl games to South Carolina. The split against LSU that we mentioned, they beat Auburn in the Outback Bowl, that Nick Marshall team with Trey Mason at running back, and then the Alabama loss. Bama is 6-1 against the Big Ten since 2010. They have routed Michigan State twice in 2 very important games, the Capital One Bowl in 2010 and the national semifinal in 2015. They've got the loss to Ohio State. It's the only loss for the Crimson Tide against the Big Ten. They had a home and home. Yes, Alabama played a home and home with Penn State in 2011 and 12. They won those games. They beat Michigan in 2012 as well. The Penn State games were in 2010 and 11. And those are the Alabama wins against the Big Ten. Okay, we got Alabama taking on Wisconsin. I got the Tide winning this series 7-3. Certainly leave your comments below. We've got in the 3-seed game, Penn State and Georgia. I like the Bulldogs winning that series 6-4. Georgia is 2-2 against the Big Ten since 2010, having defeated Nebraska in a bowl game, and then they played Nebraska the next year in a bowl game, 2012 and 2013, and then they lost to Nebraska the next year. They also lost to Michigan State in the Citrus Bowl, and Georgia also beat Penn State. Of course, that was a couple of years ago in the, I believe, Tax Slayer Bowl. Penn State is 0-5 against the SEC. What's odd about that is traditionally Penn State has played extremely well against the SEC in Joe Paterno's tenure. The Nittany Lions had a great run against the SEC, but in recent years, since 2010, losses to Alabama, home and home. Lost to Florida in a bowl game. Urban Meyer's final game at Florida. Also lost to Georgia, as I mentioned a couple of years ago, and they lost to Kentucky this past season as a pretty substantial favorite. Georgia and Penn State, I believe Georgia wins that series 6-4. We've got Michigan matched up against Florida. Remind me if you've seen this before. Those two teams played 3 times in 2 seasons, or in 2 calendar years. Michigan mauled Florida in the Capital One Bowl in 2015. Jim Harbaugh's first season when things looked very nice and very promising for Michigan football. Then in 2016, Michigan routed Florida. And then in 2018 was the loss to Florida in the bowl game this past season in the Peach Bowl. Michigan is 2-5 against the SEC, so those are the 2 wins against Florida. They lost to South Carolina twice, the Jadeveon Clowney game at the Outback Bowl. Very close game that came down to the last 5 seconds of the game. And then the game that they lost to South Carolina 2 years ago. And they also were pummeled by Alabama. And then way back in 2010, Rich Rodriguez and company, this was his ouster. This was the year that, and the game that ushered him out the door in Ann Arbor, losing to Mississippi State in the Gator Bowl 52-14. So Michigan and Florida, I'm going with the Gators winning this 7-3. The way Michigan's playing right now on offense, Gators win that series 7-3. Okay, we're matching up Iowa as the 5th seed in the Big Ten against Auburn, number 5 seed in the SEC. I've got Auburn winning this series I'm going 5-5. Auburn, Iowa. Yeah, I'm going 5-5. Hawkeyes, 2-3 against the SEC since 2010. And Auburn just 1-1 against the Big Ten, having drubbed, completely annihilated Purdue in the bowl season last year. Iowa beat Mississippi State in its most recent game against the SEC. Our 6 seeds are Minnesota and Missouri. Ironically, Minnesota's only game against the SEC in the last decade was against Mizzou in a bowl game in 2014, and Missouri is 4-3 against the Big Ten. You got Michigan State at number 7 against the 7 seed South Carolina, and I've got the Gamecocks winning, and I'm sure I'm a bit swayed by the performance against Georgia, and I should be, because it showed us what South Carolina is capable of. So I've got the Gamecocks defeating Sparty 6-4. Michigan State, of course, with the 2 losses to Alabama, and they beat Georgia in a bowl game in 2011. And South Carolina's played a lot of games against the Big Ten and fared extremely well. 2 wins against Michigan. They also have a win against Wisconsin and 1 against Nebraska in bowl games. South Carolina is 4-0 against the Big Ten since 2010. All right, our 8-seed game pits Nebraska against Texas A&M. I like the Aggies in this one, 7-3. Nebraska has a 1-3 record against the SEC since 2010, and Texas A&M has only played Northwestern in a bowl game in these 10 seasons. All right, game number 9. It pits Ole Miss against Purdue. I like the Boilers in this series 6-4. Ole Miss has not played the Big Ten since 2010. The last time I remember Ole Miss playing a Big Ten team was the 1990 Gator Bowl against Michigan, and they got pummeled 35-3. I don't believe Ole Miss has played a Big Ten team since. I can almost guarantee that. And Purdue is 2-2 against the SEC since 2010, with a couple wins against, Vandy this past season, 2019, and against Missouri back in 17, and they lost to Auburn, of course, in last year's bowl game and against Mizzou as well. Indiana is the 10 seed out of the Big Ten. They will play Kentucky, the 10 seed out of the SEC. Both teams are 1-1 against their respective conference rivals. I've got a 5-5 series with Kentucky and Indiana. All right. Our 11 seeds are Northwestern, obviously taking a tumble from making the Big Ten championship game last year, and Tennessee, the 11 seed. And I've got the Vols and the Wildcats stalemating at 5-5 in their series. Tennessee's 3-0 against the Big Ten. Despite a down decade for the Vols, they completely drubbed Iowa in a bowl game in 2014, the Tax Slayer Bowl. They beat Nebraska in a bowl game a few years ago, and they beat Northwestern easily in the Citrus Bowl under Butch Jones. All right, our 12 seeds are Mississippi State and Illinois, and I like the Bulldogs winning that series 6-4. The Illini have given little hope to the program and have shown me a little life in recent weeks with decent efforts against Minnesota, Michigan, and against Nebraska as well. A few weeks ago, before seeing Mississippi State stumble against the likes of the teams that they've lost to recently and in the manner in which they've lost these recent games, Tennessee last week 20-10, I would have opted for a larger Mississippi State margin against Illinois, but I think the Illini would play them somewhat decently after watching them again play pretty good against Nebraska and against Michigan. So Mississippi State defeats Illinois 6-4. Illinois with just one meeting against the SEC since 2010, and that was against Missouri in 2010 itself, when Mizzou was, of course, in the Big 12. Maryland has not faced the SEC since 2010. Maryland will take on Arkansas. The Hogs are 0-3 against the Big Ten. With two of those losses, too, you would never guess it. They lost to Ohio State, Bobby Petrino's team, losing to the Buckeyes in the Sugar Bowl when they were a top 5-10 team in the nation in 2010. The other two losses were against Rutgers. I remember those games very well. Even with Alex Collins, and I can't think of the other kid in the backfield. The 1-2 punch for the Hogs. They were really stumbling out of the blocks as Brett Bielema was taking over that program, and they lost to Rutgers back-to-back years, 2012 and 13. Anyway, it's the Hogs and the Terps, and I've got Maryland winning that series 6-4. And then finally, we've got the bottom of the barrel, Rutgers and Vanderbilt. And Rutgers is just that bad that Vandy wins his series 8-2. Final. So we've got 14 teams in each league. We've got 10-game series going. That's 140 games. The SEC defeats the Big Ten 79-61. It is completely unscientific. Just my thoughts on 10-game series between the SEC and the Big Ten. I believe these are the two best leagues in college football and that the SEC is number one. As always, would love to hear from you, your comments, your suggestions on content, what you would love to hear us rank and rate and analyze right here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football.